What's up, everyone? We're back. I'm with Josh Johnson, our VP of Sales. Welcome back, Josh.
Thank you very much for having me again.
Well, we are so excited because today we're talking about double closing, what it is, when you do it, all of that kit and caboodle. So Josh, start us off with just what the heck is double closing?
Double closing is exactly what it sounds like. First of all, it's closing on a property twice. In reality, what a traditional wholesale transaction is, to give a double close context, is you as a wholesaler get a property under contract, assign your role as the closing person to close on the property, and then there's one closing of the property. Your seller sells to your end buyer, and a fee on that chart in that process is some of the buyer's funds going to you for a wholesale fee, and the rest of it going to the seller or satisfying liens and mortgages and whatnot against it. So a double close actually means you do the closing of the property twice. And so seller actually sells the property to you. You sign paperwork saying, I'm taking possession of the property. You close on it. You pay the seller the fee for the property, the sale price, and then you turn around instantaneously and then sell the house to the end buyer that you have in place. And then the margin that you bought it from the original buyer is that with what you bought it from the original seller, with what you sell to the end buyer is again your margin. So tangibly, the difference is oftentimes, to do this the correct way, you need to have transactional funding in place at the closing agency or attorney to buy the property first. So if you're just starting out, that might not mean your own cash. Maybe that's borrowing from someone who specializes in transactional funding, which oftentimes is like a 1% fee because you borrow the money for literally a day. And basically what happens is all the agreements are lined up, you close on it, funds go to seller, new funds come into your account, you then pay off the transactional funding, and again, keep up what's left. And so from a funding perspective, that's a really big, important thing to note. If you have attorneys, or if you have agents or people telling you they double close without having transactional funds in place, there's a 98% chance that they are doing it illegally, and that agency or that attorney could lose their license. So from that perspective, don't be the person that tries to call a dozen closing agencies and attorneys and say, hey, I want to double close without transactional funding, because you're more often than not asking them to do something that would put their business at risk. So because legally, real estate transactions prior to closing have to have the funds for the transaction in escrow with the closing agency or attorney to then pay to satisfy the sale. And so if you're trying to say, hey, the end buyers of my buyer's funds are there, then I can purchase the property. In general, that's illegal. People try to negotiate their way around it by saying hey, my buyer's funds are there. They're going to temporarily write me a loan, put it on paper saying they're loaning me the money for this first part of the transaction. Then I'll pay them back, and then they pay me. It gets really complicated. In reality, again, without the funds in escrow to close both transactions, so your buyer's funds are there, and then your borrowed or your own transactional money is in place to close on the property, it is an illegal process to double close without that transactional funding. So that's the biggest thing I just kind of want to mention on the front end. And so again, you're closing the transaction twice. You're writing buy paperwork, then you're writing sell paperwork. You have a traditional purchase and sale agreement on both sides of the table with you as the seller or buyer in the middle of that. Now, obviously, this sounds a lot more complicated than just the one transaction and collecting your wholesale fee. So why entertain this? So more often than not, a couple of things that the most frequent reason that you're going to see that you want to potentially entertain a double close instead of a regular close is that your margin on the deal is substantially high. And especially if you don't have a super high level of trust or experience yet with your end buyer, and you don't want them to see the wholesale fee when they're closing and they're writing their paperwork on the property, that's a situation in which double closing allows you to hide your margin on the property until everything is completely closed. They would still probably be able to go to the courthouse and look at the transaction records and see what you bought it for and then sold it for. But at the moment, at the signing table, there's not going to be an opportunity for them to try to back out because they're unhappy you're making a really large wholesale fee, which is if you were wholesaling it with one transaction, that wholesale fee is a line item. They see the exact fee that you're getting paid on at closing of a property. And so that's really the most frequent reason that you're going to entertain it. Where you decide that threshold for yourself is varies. I've had some people say that they wholesale or they double close every single transaction they have, even if it's like a $5,000 wholesale fee. I've had others that say their limit's around 20,000 and they'll do it over 20,000 every single time. And then I have other people who say they're gonna wholesale a single transaction, every single thing, and the only time they make an exception is if it's like a giant deal with a brand new seller or buyer of theirs rather, that they don't know how they're going to react. Brent Daniels with TTP actually has a really good recommendation I've seen him say is he'll go after all the paperwork's in place where legally the buyer can't really back out anyways. They might go to the buyer and say, hey, you know what, like we negotiated really well on this deal on the front end, got a really good opportunity in place, still looks like a great deal for you. Do you mind if we make a lot in this deal, or would you rather, like what are your thoughts on that? And then based off that reaction with the end buyer, they might then decide to double close it or just do a traditional wholesale fee. And so that's a really good, I think, rule of thumb too, is you need to gauge what that buyer is going to do and how they're going to react. And that's probably the most risky thing to potentially worry about in the process.
That's a good point. I definitely, do you think that if you ask them though, and you're being that transparent with them and they realize you're going to double close, do you think they'd get suspicious in a way, or do you think that's just not really a big deal?
I think it's how you present it. I think the professionalism, maturity to go to them before you have to in that situation, like you're not under any obligation to come to them and talk to them about this before we close. I think a good buyer will acknowledge and respect that. And again, the ask, how you ask it does matter. I think specifically saying something like, hey, you know what, we negotiated really well on this. Do you mind knowing what we made on it at closing? Or would you rather not? Brent Daniels has that in a YouTube video somewhere, his exact process that he followed.
We will link it in the description below.
And so, but I definitely think it's a careful conversation that you want to have. And if you do have a really large $30,000-$40,000 wholesale fee in place and you don't even want to risk that conversation, just double close it. And I guess to clarify, the other downside of double closing everything is that there's added cost to it. So traditionally an extra close is going to cost you anywhere between maybe $400 up to $1,000, depending on the price of the property, taxes, a variety of other things. But that's the downside to double closing versus just a wholesale fee straight, is that there is an added cost to it as well, in addition to the transactional funding. So you might have a $20,000 wholesale fee that maybe you knock $2,500 off of in the end if you have to get transactional funding, double close it, and things like that. So there's a tangible cost to it. But if you're buying a $2,500 insurance policy for $20,000 to guarantee it, sometimes it's worth it, especially if you don't know for sure how the end buyer is going to react.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome. Well,
one other thing I'd like to mention briefly on double closing is actually, it's not the same as a double close, because a double close is traditionally thought of in the sense of we're buying and selling the property same day. But if you have the funds or the funding in place to potentially get a property under contract before you market it, especially if you know it's a really good deal, you might approach it where before I even market the property to an end buyer, I'm going to take it down because I want to get the seller out of the scenario. I want to own the property outright. So when I go to my buyers, there's no potential opportunity for them to go behind my back, talk to a seller, try to raise issues with the title and have to go through a lis pendens process because they get another contract in place and I need to then prove that I had a contract in place first. Again, if you have a really, really good deal, especially if you're doing blanket marketing to buyers that you don't know who's reading these emails and what they could do, you could take the approach, I'm going to buy the property first, and then I'm going to go about marketing it. You will then probably end up owning the property for a few weeks or something like that. But you, again, remove some of the risk in the process by not having to worry about the buyer's reaction to anything.
No, that's a really good point. Awesome. I know I've just learned a bunch of stuff. I hope you guys have too. So thank you, Josh, again for being on, and keep looking out. We're having Josh come on a lot more because, well, we love him, and we'd love for you guys to learn from the knowledge that he has of working with our enterprise customers. If you have ever been interested in our enterprise plan, please feel free to reach out to us and hit him up. But again, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, turn on the notifications, and I'd love to hear what you guys thought about this video. Tell us one of the big takeaways you've got from this video in the comments below. We answer everything. So thanks again, you guys, and happy deal finding.